All right, so I'm Tai Edwards. Thank you so much for having me. I want to thank Tracy for helping me organize this. She was so organized, and I also want to thank Greg Olson. I think I have a lot of thanks to give him for the fact that I'm here today, so thank you. So a couple of things before we go over our pieces from the book. I want to remind us where we are, right? We're in Jefferson City, Missouri, as you know. We are at the intersection of two rivers named for the Native nations who lived along those rivers, right? The Missouri, which now is the Oto-Missouri Nation, and they are a federally recognized nation, but their tribal offices and headquarters today are located in Oklahoma. The other river, Osage, is of course referencing the homeland of the Osage people, which is where we are right now. They also remain a federally recognized tribe, and their tribal offices are also located in Oklahoma. So of course the question is why? And the answer is settler colonialism, which I'm going to talk about today. Also, of course, this city is named for Thomas Jefferson. And that also is important too, because he is also central to the colonization of this region, and I'll talk about that as well. We've retained the place names of these important individuals and groups that's central to this region's history, but what we have not done as good a job is retaining our knowledge of colonialism and how those people are tied together in colonial relationships. In this book, I used Osage history as a way to study U.S. imperialism. I wanted to focus on how it was implemented, how it was experienced, and how it was resisted. In many cases, and especially with the Osage, many Native scholars, let's see if I can make this work. Uh-oh, am I pretty much, oh, I gotta turn it on. Huh? I have a PhD, can you tell? Yeah, my sister's always saying that's my pretty much helpless degree. Okay, there we go. All right, so many Native nations, the Osage in particular, have many scholars inside their nations who have been documenting their history and their history with colonialism for a long time. And I used the work of many Osage scholars in my work because the way they understand colonialism and their experience with them helps counter the colonial bias that pervades a lot of the other narratives written about colonialism. Okay, so back to the cover of the book. That's Wachite. And I will say the first time I showed my children the cover of my book, they both said, "Mom, there's a butt on your book," which was high praise from my children. But yeah, so I purposely did this. This is from a series of Catlin paintings that are fairly famous. Many of the pieces are quite famous, as you may know. And he painted numerous Osage men. And the portraits of Osage men have frequently been reproduced and are on the covers of multiple books. But to my knowledge, Wachite has never been on the cover of a book. And I think that speaks a lot to the bias about the Osage people and natives in general. And the way she's dressed is specific to her time and to the Osage Nation at that time. All right, so I focused on gender. As you probably know, gender is a construction, and I go over this with my students a lot. So what that means is every society defines for itself how many genders there are, power relations between those genders, and what they consider acceptable behaviors for each gender. So in Osage society, gender was constructed around complementarity. So let me tell you what I mean by that. The Osage priesthood organized Osage life based on the dual masculine and feminine forces they observed in celestial and seasonal cycles. Rituals required both male and female participation and defined a sexual division of labor without hierarchical difference. Spiritually, two things were necessary for continued national existence. One, women creating, and two, men protecting and providing. This meant women created future citizens, food, trade goods, and all the domestic items they needed. Men killed game animals and enemies in warfare. Therefore, men and women worked together to guarantee the nation's future. Because of their different roles, each gender achieved status and power in distinct ways. Women were born with it, and men had to earn it. But life was not as strictly divided as one might think. In order for hunting to produce anything, men had to kill and women had to process. Warfare required male valor, but women ritually combined their courage with men's, and both were credited in victories. Men held political leadership positions as chiefs, but their authority was subordinate to the priesthood, which incorporated women in a variety of ways. In other words, men and women collaborated in virtually everything, and very little could be divided into separate spheres. And so one of the things I'm focusing on is then how was this gender complementarity constructed? So in comparison to historic Western society, European, Euro-American society, it's built on gender hierarchy, right? The primacy of one gender over another, the subordination and dependence of one gender to the other. That's not the case for the Osage, and that's not the case for most indigenous North American nations. Most indigenous North American nations functioned on gender complementarity. So what we mean by that is equal genders, even though often the work of each gender looked a little bit different to outsiders. Okay, so women. Women were considered the channel through whom all human life must proceed and continue. These are English translations of Osage spiritual rituals taken in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And the Osage were considered women were considered mystic sacred power that were able to create human life, much like the creation of humans in general, right? Women did that same work. And therefore, women's work was reproductive, creative, and life-giving, right? So women were bearing and rearing children, raising crops. The Osage actually viewed farming, which was a job of women, as the same as producing humans, right? You take seeds, you nurture them, and then you cultivate them to fruition and productivity. Gathering plant foods, processing meat and hides, constructing lodges, and then manufacturing all of the domestic items they needed in addition to that. Okay, so men, the life granted by Wakanda must be protected. The woman, the children she bears, the home she builds for their shelter and comfort, the fields she cultivates must be guarded. The land upon which the tribe depends for plant and animal food must be held against invasion, and the life of the individual and the tribe itself must at all times be defended from enemies. I love how even in the English translation of this, it comes off as defends woman, the home she builds, the children she bears, right? So even men's roles is dependent on the construction of what women are doing. So their work was providing, protecting, and life-taking, hunting, diplomatic and war expeditions, and manufacturing the tools necessary for their work. So what my argument is that gender was deeply embedded in the Osage worldview and spirituality. Gender animated their lives and experiences, and they believed that survival and success required the work of both men and women. You couldn't have one without the other. Women and men, therefore, cooperated in building an Osage Empire and resisting colonization thereafter. I also argued that gender was a central site for experiencing and resisting colonization, and the toll of that colonization will be brutal, which we'll talk about in a second. So as long as Osage spirituality and their agriculture, hunting, trading economy remained intact, gender roles also remained intact because gender was a function of all that spirituality and economic organization. So I also argue that this is a period of continuity for the Osage through the late 19th century. Okay, so you might be familiar with, so some examples of separate spheres. So there's this construction that the work of Native men and women was very separate and that there was never any overlap, and that's overstated. So I want to show you some examples. So the first point, alternative gender paradigm. So another common characteristic of indigenous cultures was having a more than two gender paradigm. So you had, the way I describe it is, there was the polarization of gender, and you should think about this literally like the poles of the earth, right? So it's round, it's polarized, you have female and male on each pole, but then there is this space between. And there are different places where people can exist in different gendered constructions between those. And there's a lot of documentation of examples about that, and that's common across Native America. So this idea of someone existing in a third, fourth, or even different gendered roles in different parts of their life or in different economic situations was common. So cooking, right? That's stereotyped as a woman's sphere in Osage society, and women did prepare meals, but when women were too busy or absent, men didn't starve to death, they cooked for themselves. But because, of course, men were often gone on war and hunting expeditions, and they would need to eat, and they were capable of that. So women farmed and they owned the fields and their produce, But as the owner of the field, a woman could instruct a man to help her with, especially clearing fields at the beginning of planting. And so men would often do this. So men were frequently seen clearing fields, but it was under the direction of the woman who owned that field. So hunting, men killed, but women turned carcasses into food, tools, and trade items. And again, this was considered the same as creating human life, right? A dead carcass is useless. Trade items that are processed are useful. Sperm is useless, but creating a human is useful, right? So these are the same kinds of jobs. So war, men physically fought, but women ritually combined their courage with men's, and both were credited in victories. In diplomacy, men held political leadership as chiefs, but women contributed through hospitality and feast preparation. But probably the most important is the so-called priesthood. This was the Osage spiritual leadership that was preeminent in all matters. And in order for a man to become a Osage spiritual leader, he had to be married, and he and his wife had to be initiated together. But if he died, she could fulfill both their roles for the rest of her life. And not all of the major Osage rituals were recorded into English before the end of the 19th century, but numerous of them were all about women's roles, and so it seems like women probably held the prominent roles in those rituals, and so therefore women and men were likely of equal standing, perhaps women of a little bit higher standing, because men couldn't serve on behalf of a woman alone after she died. Only women could do that work. Okay, so you might also know that the Osage are famous in this region for building an empire. So there's a handful of native nations that most historians call native empires after colonialism begins. The Sioux are a great example, the Comanche are another example, and the Osage are an example. So what that means is they had expanding power after European colonization begins, and you can see there the areas that they controlled in this period. So there's a long history of the Osage Empire. Many people write about it, it's well documented, but it's usually credited to the work of men. So let me give you some examples. Once the French built trading posts along the periphery of Osage territory in the 1720s, the Osage became middlemen in exchanges between the French and more western and southern indigenous communities. French traders attempted to initiate trade relationships with western and southern native groups. However, the Osage prevented, violently if necessary, any threats, both native and European, to their position as middlemen. Taking advantage of their large population, estimates range from 10,000 to 18,000, and resource-rich location between the Mississippi River and the Prairie Plains, the Osage became the primary economic and military power in western Louisiana. As historian Kathleen Duval put it, the Osage proved far more successful than either France or Spain at building a mid-continental empire. Studies of the Osage Empire's rise and fall have almost entirely emphasized the lives of men as hunters, warriors, traders, and political leaders. This is a common bias in the history of war, diplomacy, and politics, topics often associated with the masculine sphere in Euro-American and Native societies. Scholarship examining the adaptability, creativity, and skill with which indigenous people built such empires has typically also concentrated on men, implying that women had little to do with men or tribal hegemony, especially if expanded power resulted from increased war or trade. Certainly hunting and war prowess directly related to a man's status, but in this society, hunting and war success, like everything else, involved women and men. Spirituality defined Osage men and women as necessary pairs. Consequently, to understand either gender or the power of the group as a whole, they must be studied together. In order to provide for and protect their communities, men had to kill animals and enemies. Conversely, women as creators and life channels did not physically associate with death. This lack of physical association has obscured women's direct spiritual and economic relationship with hunting. While men hunted, a coordinated physical and ritual endeavor, women simultaneously prayed to Wakanda for animal protection, hunter success, and community perpetuation through the birth of children. And when men returned with animal products, women commenced the laborious meat preservation and hide manufacturing that facilitated the entire community's subsistence and trade wealth. Processing the proceeds of the hunt into something useful, food, clothing, trade goods, etc., was considered a creative act under the purview of women. Scholars often passingly acknowledge the economic significance of women's work in the Osage Empire, but women's central economic role reflected their equal status with men. So, in other words, in building this empire that you can see stretches over what's almost 4 states worth of territory today, the Osage engaged in significant amounts of commercial hunting. Commercial trading. So one of their primary trade items was horses. You may know when Native groups adopted European livestock, that usually required some kind of gendered reorganization, because who's going to take care of the animals, right? And horses in particular could eat women's crops, so that could be threatening. So the Osage are not believed to have ever actually bred their horses in the 19th century, that they primarily raided for horses and then traded them from there. And so by acquiring horses in traditional male pursuits of raiding and warfare, and then trading them, which was predominantly a male task, they didn't have to reorganize gender to have that livestock. And they had a lot of livestock, a lot of horses they start having by the 1680s. Another item they traded was slaves captured from other Native nations. The French in particular were always consuming Native slaves. And the Osage are one of the groups that trade slaves. The Osage, like many other Native groups, had commonly adopted captives taken in war. The French, of course, demand captives not to adopt them into French society, but to trade them to plantation agriculturalists, sometimes in Louisiana, sometimes in the Caribbean. But the most prominent thing that the Osage traded in this period that made them wealthy was deer skins. This was their most prolific trade item. And when I say most prolific, I mean don't underestimate how much we're talking about here. So let me give you some examples. By the late 1700s, Osage men likely doubled or tripled the amount of time they spent hunting. Hunters procured enough hides and meat to occupy multiple women for days or weeks at a time. An Osage man's hunting prowess mattered little, though, without female labor, because traders demanded expertly tanned hides that would survive the trip back to Europe. Indigenous women in the hide trade generally, and among the Osage specifically, monopolized the skills needed to produce these finished goods, placing a high value on their labor. From the Osage perspective, hunting had always been a collaborative effort, but in the 18th and early 19th century, this cooperation led to imperial domination. Osage men and women produced hides on a staggering scale. Prices varied based on animal, size of the skin, quality of the processing, and European market rates. One historian called the Osage the true bankers of this region, since they produced the largest quantity of the best quality deer leather, and their bucks served as the main currency in Upper Louisiana. Typically, 20 medium-sized hides could buy a musket, and 1 medium hide could buy a horn full of powder or 2 pounds of bullets. A dressed deer skin typically weighed 1 to 2 pounds, depending on the size of the animal. Packs or bales of these skins weighed approximately 100 pounds. From 1764 to 1803, the Osage produced more than half of the hides in Spanish Illinois, amounting to roughly 600 packs of skins per year, or over 20,000 packs in total. As a result, they became the best armed Indians on the Central Plains, furthering their military and hide trade dominance. U.S. officials calculated the illegal Osage trade at the Arkansas post for just the final 4 years of Spanish rule involved tens of thousands of skins valued at over $20,000, nearly $400,000 today. During that same period, the Little and Great Osage produced over $43,000 worth of furs and hides, which is worth over $800,000 today, showing the enormous volume of their hunting and hide processing. So while their nation is expanding in size and trade, this is going to have some social implications. So some of the things that happened during this period to the nation as a whole is, and you can see this on the map, is decentralization of the nation. So you see more and more towns moving out into further and further locations. One example is the Arkansas Osage bands, which you can see beginning in the 1760s moved down to a different river system because it was so profitable for trade and for hunting. And then you can see the Great and Little Osage also separating onto different major rivers. And so decentralization of the nation was a big part of this period. Also, it's believed that the Osage before colonization were a patriarchal society, which means when a couple married, they lived with the husband's household or kin. But we know in this period, the Osage are practicing matrilocal residence. So the reason why we think that's the case is in Osage society, hunting and war efforts were done by clans. So men of the same clan would go on hunting and war expeditions together. So if you had a household that was patrilocal and there was a war expedition, that household could be without their men for days, weeks, maybe months at a time. And that could be dangerous, and it could also be a problem for food provision. So by adopting matrilocal residence, you could have only some of the men gone from a household at a time. So that kept food provision and protection in place. We also know there's a rise in plural marriages in this period, which also doesn't surprise us that matrilocal residence goes along with this. So you have women of the same extended family perhaps marrying the same man. And if those women are already living in the same household, that makes that economically easier because those women are probably cooperating in their hide processing and their other work at the same time. Now, a lot of times the stereotypes about plural marriage or polygyny or polygamy is that it subjugated women. It only subjugates women if women don't have control of marriage, control of sexuality and body, and ability to divorce. And Osage women had control over all those things. Also, marriage was not sexually exclusive, so it's not a sexual subordination. And women and men could separate from one another whenever they chose. They both retained all the property that they had before, during, and after. And so subjugation was not part of relationships that had multiple spouses. And then something that's kind of famous probably here more than other places is the marrying of Osage women to French traders like the Choteaux and others. One of the things that's interesting, the stereotype is that Native women start marrying traders early, right, as soon as traders arrive. In the Osage case, they do not do this. Osage women, especially prominent women, do not start marrying French traders until after the French and Indian War or the 7 Years' War, which is when French colonial presence is actually officially ended. And the Osage very easily dominated the French and thus built their empire. So as the French were leaving and the Spanish were supposedly going to arrive, you see prominent women marrying the remaining French traders as a way of solidifying those trade relationships in a changing colonial climate. And this is extremely successful. So let me give you an example. In August 1811, Fort Osage Factor George Sibley observed over 1,000 people in an Osage hunting camp. And I should warn you, I'm going to be quoting him here, and he has some racist quotes, so just prepare yourself. Sibley observed over 1,000 people in an Osage hunting camp in the full and free indulgence of all the luxuries of their rude condition. He noted an absence of illness and an abundance of supplies, including buffalo, elk, deer, marrow bones, tongues, hominy, beans, dried pumpkin, plums, and other dainties. Men's hunting and women's meat production, cultivation, and gathering produced this bounty. Vigilant elder warriors maintained camp security, while elder women were busily employed jerking and curing on scaffolds the flesh of the fat buffalo. Young men and women adorned in the highest style of fashion mingled in small groups. Older boys tended the horses, many girls aided their mothers, and swarms of children swam in the creek or frolicked on the prairie. Sibley concluded, mirth and hearty merriment prevailed. Never had I witnessed such general happiness in any community as prevailed here. These observations demonstrate how, even after a century of colonization, in many ways, Osage life continued to follow a familiar and clearly flourishing cycle. Not surprisingly, some aspects of their society changed to facilitate this. Nevertheless, gender complementarity remained a central aspect in both material and ritual life as men and women cooperated to build an Osage empire. All right, so of course what's going to change is going to be the arrival of United States colonialism. And so you can see how this is going to change a lot of the people that live in this region. So if you notice on the eastern side of the map, you see natives that we think of as southeastern or Great Lakes natives starting to move into this space, right? So you see Sac and Fox, Kickapoo, Delaware, Shawnees, Cherokees moving into this eastern region. So we need to explain why this is. Okay, so for the Osage, everything will change with U.S. imperialism. The United States, like the British before it, is a settler colonial empire. There are different kinds of empires. The French, for example, were a trading empire, okay, and those colonies function in one way. The US and the British were settler colonial empires. Settler colonial empires need native elimination so that the empire's settlers can possess native land. Okay, so settler empires need native elimination. So how do you eliminate natives? Well, there's various ways you can do this. You can literally murder them, right? That's genocide. You can remove them, which is ethnic cleansing. Or you can erase identity and culture, which is missionization. So there are lots of ways to eliminate natives, and Americans are going to try basically all of those tactics with the Osage in particular. So for the Osage, after the American Revolution, they're experiencing significant native encroachment or invasion, as they experienced it, into their homeland here in Missouri. And as you have more natives moving into the region, you have more competition over natural resources, right? Especially over hunting and commercial trade. And then, of course, as we all know, right, especially because of where we are right now, the Louisiana Purchase is a Jeffersonian action, and then, of course, the Lewis and Clark expedition. And as you may know, the Osage visited Jefferson in Washington before that trip is even over. So I got to explain a little bit about this, and I should warn you, if I get through talking about Jefferson without swearing, I always consider it a success. Jefferson always makes me swear, so I'll tell you why. All right, so elimination of natives in the heart of the continent accelerated during Thomas Jefferson's presidency. Jefferson spent much of his professional life employing the doctrine of discovery to dispossess indigenous people. And after 1776, this was part of his effort to build a continental U.S. empire. Legal scholar Robert J. Miller described Jefferson as one of the most aggressive and strategically expansionist presidents who ever held the office. This was on full display with the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. Though scholars have often called this the greatest real estate deal in history, in reality, Jefferson was fully aware that the United States had actually purchased discovery claims and preemption rights. Preemption rights are sole right to buy land from natives. Based on this centuries-old European legal tradition, the United States allegedly held ultimate dominion over this land, entailing political and commercial control. While native nations retained a temporary right of occupancy until they chose to sell their land to the only legal buyer, the United States of America. Though George Washington proposed it in the 1780s and Andrew Jackson infamously championed it in the 1830s, Thomas Jefferson was actually the first person to formulate an official federal policy of removal, the first to set it in motion, and the first to start removing tribes west of the Mississippi. His intention for the Louisiana Purchase was to expand upon the native migration already in progress by formally relocating all eastern native nations into this new territory. Though American historians have antiseptically labeled this the removal period, historian John McFarrager, among many others, has argued this was more accurately the era of ethnic cleansing. In a settler empire, these removed peoples serve as proxy invaders, warring with local natives like the Osage, eventually decimating all. After eastern land was filled with American settlers, Jefferson expected the United States to establish additional states in the Louisiana Territory. Evidently, the plan was to eliminate all natives in the entirety of the United States. Jefferson used the Lewis and Clark expedition to exercise discovery rights over native nations from the Mississippi River to the Columbia River. In their interactions with indigenous peoples, Lewis and Clark constantly reiterated U.S. sovereignty and indigenous economic, military, and political subordination. To this end, the president instructed Lewis and Clark to send native leaders to Washington, D.C. in hopes of further intimidating them. Because of Osage power and their central location, Jefferson intended to direct the first eastern native expulsions into Osage territory. Hence, an Osage contingent arrived in Washington in July 1804, the first native representatives Lewis and Clark sent to visit the president. You may know Jefferson also famously talks about how tall the Osage are when they come to visit him. Many Osage men, of course, were famously tall, 7 feet tall. Jefferson was considered a tall man of his time. And he also guarantees all kinds of land rights for them in the process, which of course he will not maintain. All right, so within years, this is still while Jefferson is president, okay? Within years of the Louisiana Purchase, you already have American settlements west of St. Louis, and to the Osage, these are invading, squatting, encroaching American settlements. And this is how settler colonialism works, by the way. So how does settler colonialism work? Settlers are desperate to improve their economic situation, right? That's where they're willing to do this. A lot of settlers that move on to native land face violence from natives, right? Natives view them as invaders and they retaliate. So why would settlers be willing to do this? They do this to improve their economic situation. So Alan Taylor, the historian, has said that settler colonialism operates based on one group of people's freedom coming at another's expense. Okay, one group of people's freedom coming at another's expense, and you see that here. Also for the United States, settlers do the dirty work of colonizing, right? You don't have to send in the military. Desperate settlers will do it for you, right? And they're willing to do it unpaid. All right, so the Treaty of 1808. All right, so the Treaty of 1808 was a classic example of treaty coercion. As Jefferson had instructed, Clark abruptly demanded land cessions when Osage leaders thought they were meeting to discuss other matters. In this case, invasion by and retaliation against American settlers. Negotiations were only conducted with a few Great and Little Osage leaders who did not have the authority to make land cessions, and the entire nation, Arkansas bands included, was expected to abide by the treaty's provisions. And finally, Clark flatly lied about what was in the treaty. He allegedly admitted to a friend that it was the hardest bargain against the Indians he ever made, and that if he was to be damned hereafter, it would be for making that treaty. The Osage leaders were led to believe that they had agreed to share some territory with Euro-American hunters in exchange for land payments, goods, blacksmith services, plows, a grain mill, and a new trading factory, Fort Osage, and federal military protection against rival invading natives. However, Clark, Lewis, and Jefferson claimed that the Osage had ceded their title to an extent of country nearly equal to the state of Virginia and much more fertile, on which refugee natives and Americans would settle. Osage leaders were already voicing their displeasure to Lewis about this fraudulent acquisition of 52 million acres before he had even mailed the treaty to the president. But it was to no avail. Osage historian Lewis Burns concluded, considering that all forms of compensation for these lands totaled less than 1/6 of a cent per acre, it is reasonable to suspect that someone was cheated. Osage complaints were irrelevant because Jefferson had already set in motion a plan that by 1810 had settled over 1,000 Cherokee on Osage land. By 1820, the local Cherokee population reached at least 5,000. Of all the eastern natives moving into the region, the large, well-armed Cherokee population posed the most serious threat to date to Osage access to game and the trade wealth it produced. The Osage also created alliances with Osage rivals who cooperated to steal Osage horses, attack hunting parties and communities, raid food storage caches, and burn agricultural villages. Though William Clark had promised federal protection for the Osage in the Treaty of 1808, it was not forthcoming. While natives killed each other, Osage military protection was reserved for the tens of thousands of American settlers colonizing the region. As Jefferson had intended, Indian policy ultimately functioned to facilitate American settlers' access to land continent-wide. Hence Clark, now serving as territorial governor of Missouri, Secretary of War John Calhoun, and President James Monroe, preferred to make arrangements favorable to the Cherokees, as the president is anxious to hold out every inducement to the Cherokees and other southern nations of Indians to immigrate to the west of the Mississippi. Thus, the Osage were punished for warfare with the Cherokee, culminating in another land cession treaty in 1818 that was deliberately misleading, not negotiated with necessary leaders, and its promises never fulfilled. By 1825, thousands of American settlers squatted on Osage lands, and as had been the tradition for decades, Osage leaders were forced to accept whatever payment U.S. officials offered before they lost their land completely. The result was expulsion to Kansas, and the Osage presence in their eastern homeland was effectively eliminated. So if you think about this from the Osage perspective, they went from being the dominant empire in this region, and natives in general being the dominant people in this region, for a century of colonization, to within 20 years losing that land. So U.S. colonization is rapid and it's of a different sort. And that's why in 1825 they're expelled to present-day Kansas. Okay, so the Osage had a lot of experience in Kansas, right? They had hunted in Kansas for centuries. They had used Kansas land before. What they had not used Kansas land for before, intentionally, was farming. Especially where their reservation is located, it is a difficult landscape to farm, especially in the quantity that Osage women had been farming up to this point. So all removals, not just the Cherokee Trail of Tears, all removals involve starvation and death. You usually have at least 2 years of starvation because you can't effectively feed yourself the year you're removing, because you usually can't plant and harvest crops that year, and you can't usually plant and harvest crops the year you arrive in the new place where you're living. So you have at least 2 years of starvation related to removal. For the Osage, it was 5 years, because it took them 5 years to figure out where they wanted to build their villages. Their villages is where they farm. It took them 5 years to figure out what the best land for farming was on their new reservation. It took 5 years to figure it out because none of it was good for agriculture. That was the problem. So for 5 years, they have a lot of trouble with malnutrition. So in this book, and also in my other scholarship, I focus on the impact of disease on colonized indigenous people. So if you are native, the myth we often have about natives and disease is that, right, Europeans show up, they breathe their dirty smallpoxy germs, and then natives are laying over dead, 90% of them in 20, 30 minutes. That's not exactly how it works. In order to die of epidemic disease, even epidemics you have not yet been exposed to, you have to be disrupted in some other way. So the Osage had been living with colonizers, marrying colonizers, and they don't start having epidemic death till the 1820s. 1820 is when they're expelled to Kansas. This is not a coincidence, okay? So then when they get to Kansas, disruption continues, right? They have trouble feeding themselves, they've been alienated from their homeland, and with that we see a growth in disease. And diseases, especially ones that plague the Osage in this period, are particularly harmful to women and children. So women were particularly vulnerable if they were pregnant, and children were particularly vulnerable. When you have that happen, you have a population maintenance or a population decline outcome. And for women, of course, the strength of the nation rested on their ability to reproduce. So this is assaulting gender power as much as it is the nation's population. All right, so as a result, they rely more on hunting, trade, and mobility. These are easier ways to sustain themselves. As you know, hunting and trade had always been both men and women's work. The trouble is just like when the Sac-and-Fox, the Delawares, the Cherokees are moving into Osage homeland, the Osage are now moving into someone else's homeland, right? So you have more natives competing over an increasingly limited amount of natural resources. Competition over western bison herds will be violent at times, and again, pressuring the population of bison to maintain all these native nations that rely on it. But of course, just like in Missouri, the worst problem is settler invasion. So let me read you a little bit about what that's like in Kansas. The greatest challenge the Osage faced in Kansas came from settler colonialism. As early as March 1853, more than a year before the Kansas-Nebraska Act passed, which officially created Kansas Territory, a congressional Indian appropriations bill included an authorization for the President of the United States to enter into negotiations with Indian tribes west of the states of Missouri and Iowa for the purpose of securing the assent of said tribes to the settlement of citizens of the United States upon the lands claimed by said Indians, and for the purpose of extinguishing the title of said Indian tribes in whole or in part to said lands. The goal of native elimination could not be clearer. The federal government had just signaled to eager speculators and squatters that native land rights in Kansas were temporary. And if settlers wanted access to this newly available land, they should move now. And they did. By the time Congress debated the Kansas-Nebraska Act a year later, natives faced significant settler invasion. One missionary noted that squatters were not very particular about keeping in the lines, never caring about the limits of the Osage Reservation. From this point on, missionaries and government agents documented settlers coming into the region daily, disregarding reservation boundaries, building homes, tilling fields, destroying food sources, stealing horses, and using violence, including murder, to gain Osage land and resources. Timber resources were often seized, as one federal official commented. In the first place, the Indian in his property is suffering materially by the trespasses of the whites, but the stealing of thousands of dollars worth of timber and carrying to adjoining lands as merchandise is radically wrong. The Indian is not allowed any privileges on the wild lands of the whites. If found gathering pawpaws, they are driven off like wolves. Beginning in 1853, settlers accelerated the colonization of indigenous people in Kansas, and they were well aware of their role in the settler empire. Quote, when they came, they knew they were trespassers and had no right whatever to settle where they did. But they were men who wished to fight for their rights. They became very much displeased that the government did not give them each at least a quarter section of the best land for the great hardships they had endured amongst those savages, and as a reward for their services in driving the Indians from their homes and graves of their fathers, and occupying the best lands which they, the settlers, had no shadow of title to. Speeches delivered by so-called leading men and newspaper articles further convinced settlers that Indians have no rights which should be respected by white men. Settlers generally associated in clubs, pledged to defend each other in occupation of claims, created their own militias, organized at least 3 counties entirely inside the Osage Reservation, and then applied to the governor for protection. All the while, Indian agents repeatedly requested the use of military force to guarantee reservation boundaries and remove squatters. But the neglect of the federal government to assert the supremacy of law over a few bordermen, professional squatters, was regarded as tacit approval of criminal acts by men professing to be just and honest. Hence, more settlers perpetrated the same crime, claiming the right to do what was allowed by others. But why would the federal government bother enforcing temporary land rights? Congress had already made it clear that natives in Kansas would be eliminated, and if settlers were willing to do the work, why not let them? All of this exhibited the systemic nature of U.S. imperialism. In other words, invasion is a structure, not an event, and therefore elimination is an organizing principle of settler colonial society rather than a one-off occurrence. And of course, by now the Osage knew that. All right, so settler invasion is particularly bad. I should say really quickly there, also in my work on disease, the 1850s for disease is the deadliest decade for the Osage. That disruption is particularly harmful to their ability to survive. And all of this invasion directly assaults gendered work. So one of the things settlers would do is they would steal native and Osage crops. So the Osage would dry crops to store them, they would steal them directly from the fields, and they would also let their livestock graze in Osage fields. The sad thing about this is Osage women struggle to have their crops even be successful in Kansas. They plant crops every year, but only about half of years do they actually get a harvest because drought, flood, and other challenges. And now settlers are stealing them. Grave robbing. So the Osage commonly buried their dead above ground with stone over, mounds is what they were often called, with stones over the deceased, and they buried the deceased with food and other objects central to arriving at the afterlife and being in the afterlife. And in Kansas, it seems that women dominated burials. So they also grave robbed for the food, which is assaulting the work of women. The way I say it in the book is settlers were so tired, I guess, of the Osage that they would assault the living and the dead. They would dismantle Osage homes. So Osage women, their permanent towns had huge houses that they built of wooden planks. And so settlers would either live in the houses or take the planks for their own homes. Theft of horses by the 1860s, there's 5 to 20 head being stolen from the Osage every day. And then I talk a lot more about missionization in the book. Protestants in the era of removal in Missouri and then Catholics in Kansas. Missionization, of course, assaults culture, but it also directly assaults gendered work. Missionization in particular assaulted the work of men more than it did of women. So they were trying to make men become farmers, right? And in the Osage construction, women were the farmers. And so they were trying to change the construction of how men and women viewed themselves. So no surprise, this leads to declining physical and mental health, malnutrition, and disease, significant population decline as a result. And then once the Civil War starts, there's a lot of corruption, especially by railroad companies, to try to get access to Osage land. So you can see there, the Treaty of 1865 takes away basically the eastern and northern parts of the reservation. So that was the part that was already squatted on by settlers. So the goal was to remove the Osage into what they called the diminished reservation. But before it's even approved by Congress, settlers have invaded that one too. And so there are several attempts to remove them from Kansas into what we now call Oklahoma during the Civil War. It takes several years for Congress to eventually approve that, and then you can see
sold their Kansas reservation for the Oklahoma reservation in 1870. So let me read you a few things here, and then we can do questions. Their time in Kansas was important for the Osage because they effectively used their religious and economic structure built on gender complementarity to control and direct change. With all of their struggles in Kansas, this should have been the period when the Osage people became culturally or literally extinct. As Patrick Wolfe has argued, settler colonialism destroys to replace. The United States needed the elimination of natives in order to establish itself on their territory. The pressure just to survive was intended to make the Osage and all indigenous people acquiesce to demands by federal agents and missionaries to change everything. Osage women should have been subjugated as men became farmers and everyone adopted Christianity, or the destruction and despair of it all should have killed them. But that did not happen. Maintaining gendered work and the corresponding religious practices in still relevant ways preserved their social structure that had long used self-directed adaptations to persist and even thrive in a changing world. In Kansas, they made some changes to their economic and ritual practices in light of new circumstances. However, many of the so-called old ways, though severely challenged, were still the best methods of survival. In Oklahoma, things were different, and that was where they made more significant changes. Nevertheless, the longevity and solidarity the Osage Nation has today would never have happened if they had become assimilated sedentary Christian farmers in Kansas. And that is why aspects of gender complementarity still connect the modern Osage with their imperial ancestors. By recovering the feminine, as Paula Allen termed it, we see that women and men were the main actors in both the rise and fall of the Osage Empire. The scholarly misconception that has been that men's actions produced this empire, and as a result, women's status presumably declined. In reality, the Osage conception of the world and their place in it involved gender complementarity. The only way they could survive and succeed was to manifest this duality through their spiritual and physical actions. And they did, even as American settler colonialism nearly obliterated everything. In less than a century, the Osage lost upward than 70% of their population and retained only a small piece of their once immense territory. For Americans, this destruction was intentional and habitual. Even under this extreme duress, the surviving Osage people maintained much of their established religious and economic practices through most of the 19th century, and gender complementarity, being directly connected to both, also endured. Thank you.